Tonight we've got two different spans. The first, as we have been praying in a contemplative fashion, learning an experience of our different centers of knowing, remembering that we know well how to know with our heads, with our brains, with what we can think of as the intellect. We can know in our hearts, and that is the emotion center of our being, and we speak about our heartfelt presence and other language of the heart. And the least understood center of knowing is in our Western tradition, our bodies. Children know well in their bodies. That's one of the primary ways that they know, and they're very happy knowing in their bodies. And that experience of watching a child climb a tree is actually watching that kinesthetic intelligence in action. And as we age, we become less adept at intuitively working our body knowledge. Everything becomes head knowledge, and when we come to something with only head knowledge, our intellect, we tend to get anxious if we don't know, if we're not already good at it, because our head tells us that if we're doing something, we should know how to do it, especially for adults, especially if we're respectable adults, and especially if we are people who like to think of ourselves as respectable and successful adults, which certainly would include me. And instead, what we come tonight with is what Buddhist tradition calls beginner mind, beginner's mind. And that is one way of getting out of that anxious intellect and allowing what the Eastern Orthodox talk about is for the head to sink down into the heart. So we get into a different knowledge center by being in our hearts. And the sort of superpower of a human being fully alive is when we can engage simultaneously our intellect center of knowing with our heart center of knowing and our body center of knowing. And the thing that connects our bodies most intimately with ourselves is our breath. And so in meditation and contemplative prayer and practices, there's always an attention that is brought to the breath, because that is what helps us to bring attention to our body so that we can inhabit our body, know ourselves to be embodied. And tonight's form of prayer, embodiment, is particularly important because I'm going to talk about compassion and the prayer of compassion that is known in the Buddhist tradition as metta prayer, M-E-T-T-A. And we'll just welcome Hannah, good to be with you. It's Father David here. I'm just starting on what metta prayer is. And that is an ancient Pali word that means loving kindness or compassion. It's a rich word that means many things, but among them, loving kindness, compassion, peace, empathy, connection, even friendship, as well as, of course, love and kindness. And we think of prayer often as trying to get saved from something, from being saved from the bad situation that we're in, or praying that somebody else can find a better situation in their lives. We also pray well for other people, and often don't pray very well for ourselves. And the great thing about the metta prayer tradition and the Buddhist tradition of the prayer of loving kindness is it takes sort of concentric circles and includes all of them in our prayer, in an embrace of loving kindness and compassion. And so it begins with ourself. It expands to those whom we love or have in our family or friendship circle. And it expands to the sort of another orbit, such as those who are our neighbors or co-workers, colleagues, people in our shops and neighborhoods. And then another orbit that expands out from there are the people who we actually spend a lot of time thinking about, and those are the people that we don't like to think about. The people who give us aggravation, who actually we feel persecute us, and sometimes those people with whom we are in a relationship of trauma, at the very least anger, and sometimes into full energy enemy. And if we take another circle out from that, we get to what the Buddhist tradition names as all beings. All beings, those sentient living creatures in all places that are connected with us, because everything is connected. All life, all sentient beings are connected in a web of life, and life isn't simply biology, it also includes a mystical consciousness. And so as we call each other to mind in prayer, then of course we become conscious of other people in our lives. And what the prayer of loving kindness does is it activates not one of those circles, but it works to activate, to connect with each of those concentric circles by calling somebody, a person, to mind that we can just name and reflect on and pray for. It's important that we start with ourselves in this prayer of loving kindness, because if we're not offering loving kindness to ourselves, then we are not able to love others as we love ourselves. And God was very clear, you shall love your how? As yourself. If we're not loving ourselves, then we sort of are going to find that the first stumbling block to loving others. And what did Jesus call people who love those who love them? Pharisees. It was one of his favorite sort of words of shall we say, not complimenting people on their Buddha consciousness. He thought Pharisees were those who were really good on rules, which Jesus was quite keen on rules as well, but missed the other half of the coin. And so those Pharisees are those who only get half of the picture. So the ability to love our enemies is, we'll be talking more about this in the new year, but one of the things that Christians are least good at is praying for their enemies. And that's probably because we weren't taught very well how to pray for our enemies. And there's often a facile, oh, forgive your enemies. And we pray in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And that's kind of where it's left. And the problem is it's really hard to take seriously somebody who doesn't like. I find it very hard to take seriously people who don't like me. And the more they dislike me, or the more I think they dislike me, the more difficult I find being with them. And I get confused as to what is my integrity, especially if I'm hurt by them. Should I be all about justice and confrontation and say, I'm not going to be in a relationship with you until we heal the breach that happened in the past? Or am I supposed to pretend that that breach never happened? And I get into this whole swirling mind of, what should I just do? But whatever else I'm doing, I'm not particularly forgiving them, or it doesn't go very deep, or it doesn't last very long. So the meta prayer of loving kindness repeats 4 simple prayers for ourselves, and then it repeats those 4 prayers for somebody that we love, and then it repeats those 4 prayers for somebody who we like or interact with but don't particularly know intimately, but it's a general compassion that we want for those people in our orbit. And then it's that prayer for somebody who we find difficult or impossible to love, who causes us pain. And it's not quite the same as forgiveness, which I think I want to just put as a category aside. Find a different category than forgiveness. Instead, just extend compassion on the person who I'm finding difficult to love as somebody who also experiences pain and anxiety and suffering. Because all of us in this world experience pain and suffering and loss. And what we're trying to do in loving our enemy is at the very least to acknowledge that they themselves suffer pain, anxiety, and loss. In fact, some of their pain, anxiety, and sense of loss may come from me. I may be the source of their pain, in their own misguided mind, of course, in the same way that they are a cause of my pain. So it's a linking together of orbits of our lives that sometimes we keep separate. So that's what the prayer practice is tonight. And I will simply lead as we have been doing, 7-8 minutes of guided meditation. This is a very simple and quick dive into the waters of prayer of loving kindness, because it's a good place to start. And we're all beginners in this prayer. But in the Buddhist tradition, it is really a crucial form of prayer and can be practiced all of the time, daily. It's a feature of our life because compassion in the spiritual contemplative tradition is the virtue that overcomes anger. And anger is the sin that distorts everything most profoundly and most dangerously. It sentences me to continual suffering. Whatever is making me angry that I don't let go of is the guarantee that I will continue to suffer from the thing that I'm suffering. And the sooner I release myself of my anger, the sooner I stand a chance of being released from my suffering. So in this tradition, anger is danger. Footnote, not self-righteous, not righteous anger, but I'm talking about the self-righteous anger. And I think that's really important as we consider contemplative citizenship, how much makes us angry and triggered in our current national and international life, our family systems, that we don't know how to process our anger around. And this prayer of loving kindness gives us a tool to replace or to challenge anger with compassion, and to allow the compassion to arise and eclipse and diminish and dissolve the anger that separates us. Jesus is very clear in his teaching. It's very stern in Matthew chapter 5. Whoever says, "You fool," in his heart is subject to the fires of hell. It's an amazing, it's sort of a chilling statement of just how dangerous anger is in the Christian tradition. And that there is that the number of times I've driven to New York and back this afternoon, the number of times I think I uttered "you fool" was a number of times. I've been liable to hell, therefore. My soul was in peril on the New Jersey Turnpike for most of it. Because, of course, I had to come back and pray a prayer of loving kindness with all of you. So within those complex, ironic, hypocritical moments of our life, we practice compassion, beginning with ourselves, and we're moving outward. So without further ado, I invite you to sit in whatever posture allows you to feel relaxed and alert. Feel your feet beneath your body, your hands in your lap. Pay attention, notice your breath. Any places in your body where you are feeling pain or discomfort, allow yourself to feel that. Acknowledge it, notice it, and let it go. Hearing the bell with our prayers will begin. Imagine yourself. Notice yourself in the posture that you are in now. See yourself as you are in this moment. And open your heart to yourself. If you're finding it difficult to show yourself loving kindness and compassion, mercy at this moment. Imagine somebody you love or a beloved pet loving you the way you can open your heart to yourself tonight. Feel your heart opening with warmth and loving kindness for yourself. And say to yourself, may I accept myself just as I am. May I be filled with loving kindness. May I be held by loving kindness. May I, in this moment, be happy. May I know, feel in my body the natural joy of being alive. And if we can feel our own loving kindness welling up for ourselves, our mercy and compassion, knowing that it is boundless, limited only by our imagination, let us extend our feelings of loving kindness for those who love us and wish us well and who know us well. So imagine someone whom you love dearly. Picture them and offer these prayers of compassion and loving kindness for them. May they be filled with loving kindness. May they feel my loving kindness towards them. May they be held in loving kindness. May they accept themselves just as they are. May they be happy. may they know the natural joy of being alive. I invite you to think of someone in that periphery of your life. Someone you don't know well, but wish to share loving kindness and find loving kindness for themselves, because you are sharing it with them. Someone at work, a neighbor, and picture them. May they be filled with loving kindness. May they be held with loving kindness. May they accept themselves entirely for who they are. May they be happy. May they know the natural joy of being alive. Now let us call to mind someone who is difficult in our life. Someone with whom we have experienced pain, anger, or disappointment. And without dwelling on those feelings, but picturing them in our mind, let us try to hold them in our heart. Try to say, may they be filled with loving kindness. May they be held by loving kindness. It may not be yours yet to feel for them, but you can still perhaps hope it can be felt by them. It's okay to be halfway there, nowhere near there. But still you are free to wish them. May they accept themselves just as they are. May they be happy. May they know the natural joy of being alive. And returning the gaze back to ourselves, so that we might be ones from whom a new source of compassion and loving kindness can animate and fill the universe. Let us extend to all creatures, everywhere, the multitude and totality of creation. And say, may all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings accept themselves just as they are. May all beings be happy. And may all beings know the simple joy of being alive. And as we soften our gaze and come to notice again our breath, our embodied compassion, and the compassion in our bodies. Let us be that compassion that we wish to be. You might wish to stand for a moment or roll your shoulders or neck. As we get ready for the second part, which will be very brief input from me, but I look forward to hearing your voices on both the chapter on tyranny that we are reading, or just noticing that the 19th of 20 of the lessons from the 20th century that our friend Timothy Snyder is offering us is be a patriot. And he has a simple opening section to what he means when he says be a patriot on page 111. And if you need a copy of the book, I've got one here for you. He says, set a good example of what America means for the generations to come. They will need it. Set a good example of what America means for the generations to come. That's what he means when he says, be a patriot. Setting a good example of what America means for the generations to come. And he says, I think with some realism, they will need it. And I think in that they will need it is not just a sort of cynical, you'll need it suckers sort of voice, but instead I hear an encouragement, a sort of a modeling of one generation telling its tales, telling its experience to another. And it's one of the things that encourages me in church as one of those places where people voluntarily come together as, generally speaking, a marketing failure. If we were segmented and separated a little more into specific consumer groups, we would probably buy more or do more or feel better about being where we are than the fact that we've all come together and we think, well, that's an odd person over there, and that's a strange voice, or I wish something was different than it was, because whoever shows up in a church on a Sunday is a pretty random collection of people. And so he, in this book, very simple chapter, simply says that the point of being a patriot is not that Russia and America must be enemies, and that the patriot is those people who know who our enemies are as a country and dislikes them intensely. He says the point of patriotism isn't disliking someone else, it's serving your own country. And I love that simple, keeping the attention on what it is that we hope America means, and set the example of being the American whom we want to be in the light of who and what we believe America to be. He contrasts being a patriot with being a nationalist, and I think that's a very helpful distinction, historically and psychologically, as well as politically. A patriotic a nationalist, he says, encourages us to be our worst and then tells us that we are the best. A nationalist, he quotes George Orwell, does this. endlessly broods on power, victory, defeat, and revenge. And Orwell continues, tends to be uninterested in what happens in the real world. I'll say that again because it's the mind, and I think it connects with the meta-prayer tradition of loving kindness and compassion, how different the mental space is that a patriot inhabits and constructs, and how different that space is when I am a nationalist, when I'm feeling nationalistic rather than patriotic. A nationalist, Orwell says, although endlessly brooding on power, victory, defeat, and revenge, tends to be uninterested in what happens in the real world. Nationalism is relativist, since the only truth is the resentment we feel when we contemplate others. Nationalism, another author in Eastern Europe writes, has no universal values, aesthetic, or ethics. A patriot, by contrast, wants a nation to live up to its ideals, which means asking us to be our best selves. A patriot, Snyder writes, must be concerned with the real world, which is the only place where his country can be loved and sustained. A patriot has universal values, standards by which she judges her nation, always wishing it well and wishing that it would do better. And that seems to be the direct thread with the prayer of loving kindness, that we must pray that prayer of loving kindness for our fellow citizens, for our country, always wishing it well and wishing it to be and to do better. A nationalist, he concludes, will say that democracy can't end here. Democracy will always be part of America and our country. And he says that is the first step towards disaster. That's what he calls eternity or inevitability. It's inevitable that America will always be democratic, or it's being America is eternally democratic. A patriot, he says, is the one who says that it could happen here, the end of democracy, but that I will stop it. That we, acting as citizens, can stop a trend that would undermine democracy. So I'll be very interested to hear what and how you experienced either the meta prayer in a different way in your own body or heart, reminding us to use that I, me, my language as much as I can, what my vulnerability and my feelings are, as I seek to imagine what being a patriot is in my body, in my context, in my time, or how I experienced the time of prayer and its disconnecting or its connecting with us. So over to you, and as always, those online are welcome to send anything in chat that they wish, or those who are in the room, especially welcome to come forward to the microphone so that your reflection can be heard loud and clear by everyone online as well. So that link that has gone around in the chat is a wonderful example of meta prayer in church. that was offered on Saturday as part of the Buddhism retreat. And it's about halfway through, an hour or so into that afternoon session. Who thinks that patriot is a word that is that feels good, or who feels that patriot doesn't feel like a good word? I'm interested in how generationally we experience. How did the word used to get used? And how does it feel like it's being used at the moment? Is that Herb who's raising a hand?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yeah. Well, yeah. All I have to say about that is that the word patriotism comes from father, the word for father. And it's to me, it's a love of fatherland. And it has more to say about how you feel about your own country. I don't know that it says anything about anybody else, frankly. The word nation, on the other hand, comes from the word of the country of your birth, natio. And that's been historically, traditionally formed around your language. For example, the French nation, which starts really in the nation, and nationalism starts in the French Revolution. It's the country, it's of people that speak French. Well, the German nation tends to be the nation of the people who speak German, and Italy is the nation of the people who speak Italian. Essentially, in the beginning, the word doesn't have anything to do with how you feel about other people. It's how you feel about yourself.
Yeah. So it's a strong word to be able to say, as a self-identifying word, I want to be a patriot, or I am a patriot. I am setting a good example, or seeking to set a good example of what America means for me, for the generations to come.
I think another thing there, am I on, or can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I think a patriot will be the kind of person, for example, who will probably serve in the Army or the Navy or the Air Force to defend the country. It doesn't necessarily, again, mean that they have any aggression towards anybody else. It's a defensive feeling. I don't know if anybody else agrees with that or not. Anyway.
Yeah,
I believe it's
it's very,
Pamela has her hand up.
yeah. Pamela.
Hi. So I grew up in what I consider patriotic times. There was a lot of music that was around love of country. It seemed like a natural thing to have pride in and love America. However, my children tell me they don't feel patriotic at all, which really concerns me. So, how do I model patriotism for them, do you think?
It's a wonderful question, and really goes to the heart of what that is for Snyder. And I found it so interesting that it even in that sense of modeling what it means. So where do you feel, Pamela, that you what do you think is missing? Is it an understanding? Is it an experience of the country, or a suspicion of patriotism as a form of nationalism? how do you think they would understand the distinction that is made? Sort of, is it an apathy or is it an antipathy, I guess is what I'm asking.
My feeling is that they are very cynical and mistrustful of government, and I don't think they've experienced the kind of overt patriotism that I have. It makes me very, very sad, and it makes me very concerned for the future. Where is the next greatest generation coming from?
Yes. And someone else has asked, how does one model patriotism for the next generation? Which I think is, again, these are really good questions, and I think there's something about being concerned with things as they really are. Snyder would say that there's history is really important over and over again to him, because there were moments when history could have gone a different way. And the fact that it didn't was because of, among other things, specific interventions by specific people at a specific time. And I think that gets part of what it is how do we understand, and for me, one of the illuminating points is Ukraine, the situation that Ukraine faces now, and how we're responding to it, how Ukrainians are being their own, how they're doing their patriotism. And I find that every day incredibly inspiring. Every propaganda tool and weapon is sort of ranged against them by one side. Every lie that could possibly rain down on them about fascists, and then every actual weapon of drones and missiles and tanks and artillery. So that coping with and taking their stand, I find both inspiring and illuminating. And I think the choices that people in Germany and across Europe are taking, that they're going to be cold this winter. And they have the choice to be warmer and ignore how cold the Ukrainians are going to be, or they have the choice to literally be not as cold, but not as warm as they would be, because they are going to pay some portion of that cost of the war of Vladimir Putin. So I wonder about whether that's a helpful thing. I'm going to see somebody else's comment. Lissa, as children we were taught about our country, though not all the parts of that should have been, of course, the importance of voting, being part of the conversation and being involved. I think as adults, we need to be doing this as part of our daily lives, talking to our children and modeling, teaching them what the schools are not.
And as part of my own patriotism, I can contribute to those refugee organizations that are doing, you know, the ones that are giving 90% of their income and that to help refugees get settled when they are displaced in the Ukraine. That is a patriotic thing, and I would hope that someone else could do it for me. When America, you know, if I had, people were so helpful with the 9/11 victims that survived, then that was a show of patriotism on our part. So for me, the reality is that it starts with me, and this is something that I can do. It's small, but it's something I want my children to learn, to share. No matter, you know, and to do it, I would do it if Russia was the one that was the victim. I would do it the same way. Because after all, we're just one kin. We're kin to each other. That's it. That's the status.
Mel.
I think this reading, this is taken from Joan Chittister's book. Maybe some of you read it today, but I'll put the word patriot in it. I'll read it twice. A real contemplative takes the whole world in and shelters it, reverses it, and protects it with a body made of steely substance of justice that springs from love. A real contemplative patriot takes the whole world in, shelters it, reverses it, protects it with a body made of steely substance of justice that springs from love. That's from Joan Chittister's book, Illuminated Life.
It's a beautiful statement of strength and taking the world in and reversing it. It's what metta prayer does. Pamela's included in the chat again. I wonder if Americans even love the country enough to defend it the way Ukrainians are. It's a very scary thought for her.
David, I have another comment.
Please.
I have another. Well, I think there's a similarity between Putin and the Ukraine and Hitler and the Western world. I think that the Ukrainians are fighting for their homeland, their fatherland, their nation, and they're gonna really fight hard against it. Putin is leading a fight that is aggressive, and they're on the defensive. And I think in the case of Hitler and Western world, Hitler was attacking the Western world, and we were fighting to defend it. I grew up in a very patriotic generation, and when I was young, and you looked up and down the street, every family had people my age who were going into the service. And we did our stint of 2, 3, 4, 5 years. We didn't stay in for 20 or 30, but we did our bit. And that was expected. People did it gladly. We're proud of it. What changed, I think, was not Korea. The Korean world was still very patriotic. It was the 60s with Vietnam. Vietnam changed everything. After Vietnam, you have people running away to Canada to get out of the draft and so on. And today, I read in the paper that the Department of Defense is 15% below its recruitment rate for the year. It's a trend that people are not feeling the same now as they did in the 50s and 60s, up to the 60s. I really think the 60s were a watershed. Where we go from there, I don't know. I'll listen to the rest of you.
I think if we can commend a reversing of that Joan Chichester is saying, a reversing of the world's disorder is what, being the change we want to see in the world is patriotism, and bearing that, and I hope we can raise that with our children and our children's children, to ask those questions that are what Timothy Snyder is about, is that certainly my generation and those of my children's generation can be stuck in this. We grew up in a world where it was the end of history. You'll remember Francis Fukuyama's article in Foreign Affairs, and it was the end of history. The West won the Cold War. The communist dialectic was intellectually bankrupt as well as economically, and there's really no more opposition to, there's no real need for patriotism anymore, because the liberal Western democratic values were just going to continue to go from strength to strength, sweep in front of it all opposition, and all would be well forever. And I think my generation, that was an assumption. And I think perhaps part of what certainly our daughter's generation may experience is that the incredible, overwhelming vagueness of climate change and its challenge globally. It's a rising temperature that's the enemy. It's not exactly, put on a uniform and fight the rising temperature. It's not the same kind of enemy. But how do we call ourselves to stand, to make our stand for the values of what our country wants to be, and reverse those, to bring in those disorders and reverse them, first in our hearts, or with our hearts, and crucially with our deeds. And I would hope for some that might be, and if I had any advice to our armed forces recruiting efforts, I would say that's the pulse they need to be feeling and expressing in a new generation. And hopefully the experience of the agonies of what we see in Ukraine and Taiwan and in Israel and Palestine could be, and in the coastlands of our country, where we can put some more courage. So that's next week. We'll be talking about courage, I think. Cordelia will be leading us in what being as courageous as we can be looks like. And then the one after that, our final session 2 weeks from tonight, I think, is election night. And we'll be with Salim Muniyar talking about what reconciliation looks like and doesn't look like at the moment in Israel and Palestine. And I encourage you to come to that in person. We'll make it available online as well, but come in person and invite children or grandchildren to come and see something that hopefully is an attempt to reverse the situation as we find it.
When we see our citizens step up to the plate and doing good things, such as in disasters, point out the action. Taking care of others in need, neighbor helping neighbor, point it out to our children, or better yet, join in as a helper.
Yeah. And thank you for that. It's that practicality that we can do together. And I am excited about what Christian patriotism can look like that isn't Christian nationalism. That's one of the things that you'll be pleased to know, I'm not going to answer, you're not going to come up with any quick program for. Dicing with those words is dangerous enough that I'll keep my own counsel long enough. But if you have any wisdom to whisper to me in the coming weeks, please do. What does Christian patriotism look like?
And we have only now to practice it.
Yep.
What we can do now to practice patriotism of any sort is what we can do now.
Yep.
And there are lots of things that we can do regarding, patriotism and seeing ourselves as part of a larger world where we're all people, we're all God's family.
And it may be exactly why contemplative patriotism
Right.
is a better, like, contemplative citizenship that Cordelia came up with for us is a helpful way. But let's let each other go to bed or dream up and send me an email on contemplative patriotism. Good night, everyone.